And thanks for inviting me. Hope everybody can hear me well. It's lovely to join you and to see some, well, I was going to say old faces, but perhaps more diplomatic to say familiar faces amongst the crowd. It's important to talk about this issue of drones, important issue, particularly today, as some of us have already said. The Conservative government announced their integrated review, as they call it, of defence and security and foreign policy, and drones and as well nuclear weapons and other high-tech equipment are very much core, as they see it, to helping the UK secure their interests around the globe. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and in that short time I'm going to say a bit about what drones are and what the problem is. I know some people here will know a great deal about drones, some will know less, most of us are somewhere in the middle, but I think it's important just to say a little bit about what they are, and then to say a little bit about what's happened in particular over the last couple of years to bring us up to date, and that of course includes the development of in Belfast of the new contract to build the Loyal Wingman drone. And then, of course, looking forward to what John has to say. And then the kind of heart of these evenings are often the kind of questions and answers and discussion. It's very hard to cover everything about drones in a neat little talk. So questions and answers are very, very helpful. I'm also going to show some slides, if that's okay. So I will actually disappear for a bit just to show you the slides, but let me just double check that I can do this. We practiced it last night, so here we go. Right, hopefully everybody should be able to see that. Lovely. So the kind of rise in the use of drones has been remarkable, really. A little more than a couple of decades ago, drones were a fairly obscure technology, primarily used for target practice by the Air Force and the Navy. But now they've become virtually central to the way we fight wars. Drones, I would argue, encapsulate as well how technology is changing warfare, and is very much part of an attempt to make warfare more acceptable to the public again. And firstly, just to be clear, when I speak about drones, I'm talking about the armed aerial unmanned systems rather than the kind of ground or naval drones that are being developed, but they're much further behind in their development than aerial systems. And smaller reconnaissance and surveillance and also commercial drones are now being equipped with munitions, and I can say a little bit about that as well, but generally speaking, when I talk about drones, I'm talking about the large armed aerial systems. So some argue that there's little or no difference in effect between drones and the traditional, inhabited or manned aircraft, but there are real and significant differences. And firstly, and most obviously, I guess, they are operated remotely over great distances via satellite links. And while the drones themselves are located near the point of operation, once they're launched, control can be handed over to pilots sitting thousands of miles away. And in the case of the UK, at RAF bases in Lincolnshire and Las Vegas. So the second major difference, as well as remoteness, is persistence. Due to the lack of any crew being on board, drones can remain in the air far longer than a piloted aircraft. So typically a fast jet aircraft, F-15 or something like that, can remain in the air only for about 8 hours before the crew, the pilots, are too fatigued to be at the peak capability they need to be. Where drones can stay in the air far longer, around 18, 20, 24 hours at the moment. And the new one that the UK is acquiring is supposed to remain airborne for about 40 hours. So crews simply change shift on the ground. They change every 3 or 4 hours while the drone remains in the air. And so it's this ability to engage in aerial strikes and aerial surveillance with no risk to your pilots or crews, together with this great persistence, which enables drones to hunt for targets of opportunity. And these two things are seen as important strategic advantages. And I want to kind of highlight in particular two ways that has an impact. So firstly, as we all know, in modern times, there's a real political cost for governments to launch overseas military intervention. And the politicians know the public don't like to see young men and women sent overseas, often for wars which have unclear aims or remote aims. And in particular, the public don't like to see those same young men and women coming back in wheelchairs or coffins. So this potential footage, TV footage of grieving families awaiting the returning injured or killed troops is a real restraint on political leaders weighing up the option whether to use lethal military force. But if you take away that potential political cost by using unmanned systems, it makes it much easier for politicians to opt to use lethal force, particularly when populist press is baying for blood. So drones, I think, push the balance away from engaging in the often, undoubtedly difficult and long-term work of solving root causes of conflicts towards quick, short, sharp, populist take out the bad guys fix. And secondly, drones, through this being persistent in the air, enable kind of a rapid reduction in response time, as the military call it. So broadly speaking, there are two types of airstrikes. Pre-planned, that is, the Air Force says we're going over to here to hit this building or to strike this airbase. That's one type, pre-planned. And the second is dynamic. That's it when the aircraft is in the air and targets are spotted. With the rise in the use of drones, we're seeing this rapid increase in the use of dynamic targeting. And I want to kind of mention here in relation to this, a young man called Navid Bullock, who's 24-year-old from Pakistan. And you won't remember his name, but you'll remember about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a large truck driven into a crowd at a Christmas market in Berlin. And 12 people were killed in that horrific attack, and a huge number of others were injured. But in the aftermath, several people spotted a young man running away and contacted the police. And some followed him, chased him at a distance, keeping in touch with the police on their phone all the time. And they tracked him for several miles before he was run down in a park, hiding under a bush and detained. And that was Navid Bullock. And within hours, it was all over the press globally that they'd caught the perpetrator of this horrific attack, a refugee from Pakistan. But 24 hours later, he was released without charge. He'd be able to prove categorically that it wasn't him. He wasn't involved in the attack at all. But if that was a similar scenario in Afghanistan or Yemen or Iraq, and Navid had been running away from an attack, and because he was frightened or scared or whatever, and he'd been followed by drones rather than members of the public on their mobile phones, you can easily imagine a kind of dynamic decision would have been made. And he wouldn't have had 24 hours to prove his innocence. He would have been killed in a drone strike. So these are just two of the ways in which we see that drones are problematic. Overall, we see that they're lowering the threshold for the use of force, eroding human rights norms, and transferring the risk of warfare from combatants to civilians. So that's a very quick introduction to the problem of drone warfare, if you like. And I can say a lot more about all these things in questions and answers. But I want to also say something a little bit about what's happened over the last couple of years. And unfortunately, I can't really report anything other than an expansion of drone warfare. The US and the UK and Israel in particular continue to use drones both in recognized armed conflicts to which there are parties, for example, in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, but also well outside those battlefields in places like Somalia and Yemen and Libya, including for what has become known now as targeted killing, assassinations, as we used to call it. And the US assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani last January is perhaps the most newsworthy example over the last couple of years. And the targeted killing of a senior Iranian military officer sent shockwaves around the globe, really, and appalled many. And international law scholars were unequivocal in arguing that the strike was unlawful. But what can't be denied is that the strike was, had its roots in and is builds on much expanding culture of targeted killing that has arisen with the advent of armed drones. And while Soleimani's killing got huge amounts of media attention, many others go virtually unremarked. Hundreds of individuals in a whole host of countries have been labelled as terrorists and hunted down and killed in drone attacks. And hundreds, perhaps even thousands of innocent civilians have been caught up and killed in these strikes, which have received little attention and are virtually unknown to the public. The UK, Britain, continues to operate its fleet of Reaper drones at the moment over Iraq and Syria, and occasionally launching strikes. There were 3 strikes last week, not by drones, but by other British aircraft. Even though both the Iraq and Syria have declared the war against ISIS over. And this is another problem with drones, forever war. When we're sending troops overseas, there is a pressure to bring those troops home when the war ends. But when there are no troops, when we're only using drones, there is no such pressure to bring the war to an end. But the UK is also now using its Reaper drones outside of operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but is point blank refusing to say where they are and what they're doing. There was no announcement about this. Drone Wars discovered it through its FOI work, and we've tried to find out more, but all parliamentary questions and FOI requests are refused on grounds of national security. We've appealed this secrecy, and the Information Commissioner says that she recognises there's a serious and weighty matter of public interest here, but for the moment they're upholding the MOD's refusal, and we will go to court later this year to try to find out some more information. But that's likely to take a long time, at least another year. And again, another problem with drones is that the way they can be used in secrecy and with little transparency or oversight. But many other countries now, besides the US and the UK and Israel, are regularly using armed drones. Our last update on the proliferation of armed drones at the beginning of January shows there are at least 20 countries now operating armed drones, with at least another 20 or so close behind. It's very difficult to be accurate about who exactly is using armed drones because of the secrecy, particularly around arms exports. So over the last year, really, drones operated by the United Arab Emirates and Turkey on behalf of warring parties in Libya, as well as Turkey's use of drones in support of Azerbaijan in the brief but very deadly conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, drew some coverage, but kind of mainly of the look how amazing these machines are coverage. But behind the scenes, there continues to be huge numbers of civilian casualties from drone strikes. But all the operators, all the countries operating them, continue to insist that drone strikes don't cause civilian casualties. And the UK has a particular bad record at this, insisting, for instance, that only one strike in the thousands that it undertook in Iraq and Syria over the last 4 or 5 years has caused one civilian casualty. And even the US has been a bit fed up with the UK. The US has said that a number of other strikes have caused civilian casualties, and these can be attributed to the UK, but the UK is refusing to accept responsibility for them. But as well as looking at what's happened over the last year or two, we also need to look, I'm afraid, at the future. And in the very near future, the UK is acquiring the Protector, this latest version of the Predator drone, which is called Sky Guardian by the manufacturer, but the UK has renamed it Protector to give it a nice fluffy name. It's much bigger than the current Reaper and is able to carry more weapons, and is also able to take off and land autonomously. But the really big difference is that it will be used, if certified by airspace regulators, to fly domestically in the UK airspace. And both in the US now and in Europe, there is a very large push, strong push to enable these large military grade drones, which fly, as they call it, beyond line of sight. Because in the UK, as people know, you can only fly a drone now if you can keep it in your line of sight. But that's seen as a big limit on the expansion of the use of drones. So the real push now to fly drones much further. So over the last 18 or so months, we've seen a real step forward in the use of drones by British government agencies, including the police and the Coast Guard and the military for border patrol. You'll remember that in response to the hysteria about refugees crossing the English Channel this summer, the government announced it would be using military drones, the Watchkeeper, to patrol the channel. Elsewhere, we have begun to investigate the use of drones by the police, and we found huge numbers that all the police, virtually all the police forces, 40 out of 48, are now regularly use drones, including for the monitoring of protests. We were quite surprised about how they were quite willing to tell us that they've been using drones for protests. And the PSNI, in fact, told us that they had 4 drones for covert use, police covert use. They wouldn't tell us about, 4 drones for overt use, but they wouldn't tell us about the number of drones and what they use them for covert use. But they've said they've used them at least 24 times over the last 8 months. That's the first 8 months of 2020, that was. For both public order and missing persons, and also for wildlife protection operations, which is very strange. But as well as the push of drones into the domestic arena, there's also a push to develop much more advanced drones. The drones that we have at the moment, the Predator, Protector, Reaper, they're kind of like the biplane era of the drone warfare. And we're now really seeing a big push towards develop much more autonomous and advanced drones. And the UK is funding a new combat air system, which is called Tempest, or it's called Tempest at the moment. And it isn't clear at the moment. They're keeping their options, whether this will be a drone, whether it will be unmanned, as it's called, or whether it will be a piloted, or it may have both, the option to have both. And as part of this, as you may well know, the UK is developing what is called the Loyal Wingman drone. This is a small drone which can be controlled in part by an aircraft, but has a high degree of autonomy. And so I have to be clear, when I say a small drone, I'm not talking about like the quadcopters that we're talking about. We're talking 3 or 4 meters long, so fairly long, but much smaller than the kind of armed drones that we know of. So in January this year, the MOD announced it was giving, as I'm sure you all know, a £30 million development contract to a consortium led by Spirit Aerospace Systems. And this was quite a surprise to many of the people who've been following this, that Spirit got this contract. But I understand that they took over the Bombardier factory last year in Belfast, and I do wonder whether it was part of a quid pro quo for them taking over the factory, was that they would get some of these contracts. Don't quote me on that, that's just speculation. But Loyal Wingman drones are still very much an idea that's in its infancy. They're not yet in operation with militaries around the world, but many countries, or several countries at least, are developing: the United States, Australia, Turkey, and the UK. And the idea of such drones is to fly alongside or slightly ahead of larger military aircraft to undertake surveillance, or what they call electronic warfare, which is jamming of radar systems and defensive systems, or laser guiding weapons onto targets, or to carry out air-to-ground strikes or air-to-air combat so engaging in combat with other drones or other aircraft. So we're seeing now, we've kind of come to the beginning really of to the end of the beginning of the first drone wars era. And we're beginning to see now drones proliferate both kind of horizontally around the globe, but also vertically in different types of drones, loyal wingman drones, swarming drones, stealth drones, all sorts of drones. And in terms of the capability they can undertake. So that's a very quick and brief intro to what's happening in regard to the use of drones. It's obviously going to be a local issue now in Northern Ireland, but of course it's very much a global issue. Drones will kind of enable states now to engage in what they call risk-free warfare, and are also moving very much from the military sphere to the domestic sphere to be used both at home and abroad. So I'll grind to a halt there, Rob, if that's okay, and very much look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Chris. If you could exit the view there, that's great. Thank you very much. That's a very, given the time that you had, you've done an amazing job in covering so many different angles of the topic. And I know that there will be a number of questions to you after John has spoken. So for the moment anyway, thank you very much, Chris. We're moving on now to hear from John Maguire, who is going to kind of put things a bit more into the Irish context, and not, I mean, in covering necessarily sort of a very detailed analysis, but an overview of, if you like, the militarization which has been happening. But I don't want to put words into John's mouth. John is perfectly capable of putting lots and lots of words into his mouth, but all of them wise. So John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I apologize a bit that I'm wrestling with sinusitis, so I hope my voice holds up. And thank you so much, Chris. It's wonderful to have you here and work with you. And you've given us such an idea of the changing landscape and the reasons why we should all be very concerned about the notion of drones being seen as a basis for prosperity on this island. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit. I'm very conscious that we're at the start of a process here with this network, which NATO have been so central in inaugurating, and that we're adding a dimension to the work that's been done and still is being done by PANA, Shannon Watch, the People's Movement, Irish Anti-War Movement, AFRI, and other organizations on the whole issue of militarization. And what I will try to do briefly, and I'll run through it as quickly as I can, is to look at some features of what I call the policy landscape in which we'll be working. And it'll be as useful for what I leave out and people bring up as what I put in. And the bad news is I'm planning to write something at some length on this later on, so I hope people will hold me to that. So a couple of quick points about some features of the policy landscape, and then an illustration from an extremely disturbing meeting that I attended just over a year ago in February 2020, just before the lockdown. It seems to me there are a number of features, and I'll just bang them down. Brexit. With Brexit, it seems to me that NATO is going to become far more clearly, even more clearly, the spine between the UK and the EU, the spine within the EU's military policies, and the spine on this island, because part of the island is in NATO, and of course we're in NATO's so-called Partnership for Peace. So there's that element that we're dealing with NATO on the whole island and beyond. And also, without preaching to anyone, I'm very aware that in our work on an all-island basis, we'll need a kind of creative sensitivity to the peace process and to the need to ensure that that it's a real peace process, maybe in some ways needing to be restored, rather than just an instance of suspended war. And locally and globally, maybe that's an issue for us, to have real peace processes rather than just suspended war. I suppose I've got not news to anyone, but a rather dark reflection that those of us working in the peace movement in Ireland, something has definitely changed for us now, or something has become clear. That is that we're in the belly of the beast. Any notion that people like myself might have had, I'm talking to myself here as well, any notion we might have had of any kind of innocence, that we were just trying to stop things happening somewhere else, I think is gone. That's always been false because of Shannon. And now we're finding the full military machine, the full military reality landing into both parts of our island. I would say we have a military, industrial, governmental, bureaucratic, academic, and journalistic complex in which there's a very broad consensus basically on the notions behind the war on terror, and maybe even a new Cold War. And there's a consensus on what the security problems are and what the answers are, most of them military. I don't think we've any basis for optimism, but I hope at the end or in the discussion, depending on how fast I move, that I can bring out the fact that we have real grounds for hope, where hope is a matter of acting for the world we want, rather than just wishing it. So I'll ask you to come with me just over a year ago into the Helix in Dublin City University, a shiny chapel, maybe even cathedral to science and technology, aptly named the Helix. The occasion is a summit that was run there by Sloan Doyle. If you're able to put up the first slide there, that would be handy, Rob. Sloan Doyle is an organization which, interestingly enough, like all the bodies I'm talking about here, clearly from the map operates on an all-island basis, and it has called itself the Security Summit. It held this very glitzy occasion in this very attractive meeting place, and it was in its literature, if you can go to the next slide, Rob, you will find that it talks very, very excitedly, if you like, about the synergies it's going to create between government and business and academia. But never once in any of the literature did I find the word soldier mentioned. So the new mantra seems to be, don't mention the warriors. You talk about everything else, or sometimes this coy phrase, end user, is employed. So now, I've used up some time already. What I want to do is go with you to a particular room, the space, where we're having a session on driving security and defence research in Ireland. That's enterprise and research in Ireland. It's opened actually with a keynote from the deputy head of DASA, the Defence and Security Accelerator in the UK. And then we have a commandant of the Irish Army, because though not mentioned, soldiers were there in large numbers and sometimes in tremendous voice as well. And she gives us an account of the process in the Republic. One of the points that she makes is that she was quite insistent on this, that the process of military research, defense research so-called, is now industry driven. And I took that to mean that things are being offered by industry to the military rather than the other way around. And that's something which was endorsed by the consultant from Vedette, a very prestigious, I think, UK-based consultancy firm, which I think wrote a lot of the game plan for this summit. It features large in the literature. We could go on just as I speak to look at the next one, which has a list, Rob, of the sponsors behind the Sloan Doyle Summit. Their website is nssi.ie, nssi.ie. But all the time I've been preparing this talk, the website has been in maintenance mode. I don't know what's happening there. But the man from Vedette agrees about the process being industry driven. Then the man from Enterprise Ireland, the official body, official government body, takes up another point from the commandant about the importance of the changing European landscape. And he is very clear that, as he puts it, Europe makes things happen. Europe is the great attractor. And he's quite clear that we're going to be sending a lot of money to PESCO and the EDF, etc. And he's quite explicit, we want to get a fair bit of that money back. So we can kind of forget about lamenting about peace dividends. These people are flaunting a war dividend. They're going to tell us, don't worry about sending all this money because it's going to bring research, factories, jobs, etc. The man from Vedette chips in there on what he calls the prosperity angle, and he talks about a triple helix of government, industry, and academia. Again, don't mention the warriors, and rarely even the so-called end users. This provokes what I'll call an eruption from a soldier not in uniform, a retired general, who says everybody is forgetting the elephant in the room, what he calls the unchallenged ideological fog among the people of Ireland. He says we've got to have the debate because everything's being held back by the fact that the people of Ireland don't understand the realities. The commandant reassures the retired general, having said, of course, you're still a general, so I'm not going to disagree with you, but she reassures them that lots is happening, there's lots in the pipeline. I have a couple of minutes more, Rob, and I will leave the rest of it then to afterwards. Am I all right for time there?
You're okay.
Yeah. Okay. So she reassures the commandant that there's lots happening and lots in the pipeline. And the man from Enterprise Ireland comes in there and he says very specifically, he reassures the general, the institutions are moving, he's saying, but not Citizen Ireland. This prompts a researcher from the National Digital Research Council to float an idea. He says, why don't we have a citizens' assembly to clear up that ideological fog? He talks about some of the examples on various policy issues in the Republic, and he says, these citizens' assemblies are reasoned and evidence-based, and they lead to thoughtful responses. I think we should be very aware of this. A couple of years ago, I would have been at meetings like this under the strict Chatham House rules in the Department of Foreign Affairs or whatever. People were talking in hushed and hesitant tones about stuff they're trumpeting now. And these people are confident enough that they're thinking of setting up a citizens' assembly to clear our minds of nonsense. Finally, and this is the final point I'll make here before just striking the note of hope and then staying quiet for questions and discussion. A final point is raised, which I think is also of great significance. An ordinary member of the gathering, not on the panel, but clearly involved in this area, he points out that, as he calls it, elements of academia are frustrating the development of military research in the universities. The man from Enterprise Ireland kind of half smiles and says, I think I know the case you're talking about. I think they suggested Galway. And rather ominously, he said, don't worry, there are mechanisms for getting stuff out. So any notion of academics who aren't into the program holding this up doesn't seem to worry them. Rob has put up there a slide from the aeronautics group, one of the many groups. This was an ideal bombs exhibition. I mean, this was a trade fair for the Irish military. And we were meant on the same day to get a demonstration of drones. It might have been by aeronautics, I don't know, but it was cancelled. Why, I don't know. But on the 2 days of the conference, 25th and 26th, in all, there were 5 strikes by aircraft or drones in Kunar province in Afghanistan. I'd like to follow those up. That's the reality of what we were looking at in our tidy ivory tower. So those are simply, it may not be great news to many people, but to me, the confidence, the openness, and the raucous contempt and impatience of many of the military in some of the discussions here strike a totally new note in our policy landscape. As I say, we've no grounds for optimism, but we have perhaps grounds for hope. Why? Because what annoyed the general is a huge commitment by ordinary people in Ireland to neutrality, to peaceful conflict resolution. And we need to make that a people's issue, not just a movement issue. A number of charities over recent years in this country are now joining the dots and realizing they can't spend their efforts on trying to rebuild a world that's constantly broken by war. The trades unions are going to have to be an area we work with, and at least the Congress of Trade Unions passed a resolution against PESCO in July 2019. And finally, students, young people, that's going to be crucial. And there is good news, because cooperating with PANA, there's now a group in Trinity following a very successful divestment campaign on ecological issues. They've now started, Students for Peace, calling for divestment from military investments and military expenditures. So we've no grounds for optimism, but we have grounds for working, hopefully, and we have maybe we're just in the gullet of that beast, and we might induce it to vomit us out if we organize ourselves properly. I hope I haven't gone on too long there, but thanks very much.